We're early. It's unbelievable, but we are here and we're early. Today, we're going to talk about a very complex and difficult period in American history, generally referred to as Reconstruction. Reconstruct what? Reconstruct the rebel South, the 11 states that left the Union and are now back being occupied by Northern armies. It's important to understand that it was more than the return to the Union. It was a military occupation that was deeply resented and became extremely complex. Someone asked me about last week when we talked about Lincoln himself, the man, and I told you I preferred the very human man with all of his mistakes, as opposed to the man that you find in the Lincoln Memorial carved out of marble. But anyway, we have this time. Lincoln is now dead. A man from Tennessee who owned slaves was former vice president and now is president, and he will be impeached, but he will escape by one vote in the Senate. And he is not a supporter of the radical Reconstructionists. Anyway, last week, people wanted to know why we didn't talk about Lincoln's cabinet. And they were a difficult group at best. And a great woman writer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, wrote a great book, The Team of People Around Our Friend Mr. Lincoln. Team of rivals, in fact. The reason I didn't do that was there is too much to do with Lincoln in 1 hour. But we could have stopped with his Secretary of State, who bought Alaska, who negotiated the sale from the Russian Tsar's government and brought this frozen part of the Northland, which was called Seward, for Secretary of State Seward's Folly. Turned out to be loaded with gold and other things that made it a very valuable addition, finally, to the Union many decades later, initially just bought, and bought legally. So there were no qualms about that. It wasn't Jefferson going off and dealing with another Napoleon and just spending the money without the authority of the Congress. And so we had that man in the cabinet doing that thing. We also had Salmon Chase dealing behind Lincoln's back. So you could have dealt for a long time with those people, but we didn't. We tried to stay with Lincoln himself, his own follies, his own failures, and his great success as president. So we didn't do that, but we could have. There's another book we could have all spent time with, a much earlier book. You know it as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, obviously a bestseller north of the Mason-Dixon line. Story of little Eva, Simon Legree, good people, bad people, runaway slaves. But we didn't do that. Later in our history, a wonderful New Yorker by the name of Jerome Robbins was asked by Rodgers and Hammerstein to create a piece of choreography in the middle of their musical. The musical was A King and I, opening to great success on Broadway with this strange bald man named Yul Brynner and a marvelous British actress who's soon to die, then made into the film with Yul Brynner and Deborah Kerr replacing the dead British actress. And what does he do? He says, well, let's think about the King of Siam. This is Anna and the King of Siam turned into a musical known as The King and I. The king had a group of women who more or less were his slaves. So why not do a ballet in the middle of this musical about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so Jerry Robbins creates this magnificent piece of music. Well, not the music itself, but the choreography. And you have this story retold again to modern audiences. You have Simon Legree, again, the bad guy, and you have little Eva and her friends trying to escape. They are going to be runaway slaves that would head for the Underground Railroad and head north. And so you had this wonderful moment where Rogers and Hammerstein, who were always conscious of the race problem, put this, as they did also in their wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning South Pacific, a very major number called You Have to Be Carefully Taught, which is about disliking even people who are brown, people like Tahitians, because there is a French planter who has been married, and then the wife dies, but she leaves him with two children of a Tahitian woman, which is very much looked down upon by the Americans now occupying this South Pacific island. So these problems haunt much of American culture. Now, you could also argue, because from the whole time, since we are loaded down with poets here at Piedmont Gardens, with arguably the world's and America's certainly greatest poet in the 19th century, who wrote a very long book-length poem, Leaves of Grass. And this particular work started sort of small and grew, just like Topsy grew and grew. And so it was that you have this wonderful work, and you have it by a man who comes to the South, well, at least to Washington, D.C., and works during the Civil War as a male nurse. And as this male nurse, his name, of course, is Walt Whitman, he experiences the death and dying of this terrible war, and it impacts his work. And his work has gone on to impact American society. If you remember watching with me Dead Poets Society, all during that particular wonderful film, Robert Williams is teaching his students Walt Whitman when he teaches them to say that long beginning, which is, Captain, my captain, you're talking about the leaves of grass. So we could have spent time with that poet and his time as a male nurse in that long and bitter war, which impacted his life for all time, because he went on writing this poem over and over again. In fact, we have around 9 editions of it, because it grew each decade by a little length, added to it, and then subtracted and then added again. The great poet Walt Whitman. But we didn't do that. We spent our time just with Lincoln, the human being, which is difficult enough, because he was a difficult person. And he wanted to have a different South when the war was over. He wanted to bring the South back into the Union as quickly and as gracefully as possible. He had many other cockamamie ideas that didn't work out, like sending all the slaves off to Africa. And he forgot to notice that most of the slaves in the United States were born third generation in America. They were Americans, they weren't Africans. But we can overlook that fault in Mr. Lincoln. He was looking for the easy way out, and there was no easy way out. Instead, you're going to have over a decade-long period called Reconstruction. You're going to have the radical Reconstructionists who are in the Congress and are determined to overwhelm Lincoln's plan and to overwhelm Johnson's plan. They even try to impeach him. And so it is, you have to deal with this period in the South when Northern armies actually move south and stay south. We do not send them home. We have an already very unfair version of a draft. And so now you're going to have a Union Army in South Carolina, one in Georgia, one in Alabama. Then you're going to have riots. In 1866, you're going to have a terrible race riot in Memphis. And in 1866, you're also going to have a massacre, a race massacre in New Orleans. So it is not going to be easy. Even a congressman moving into the South is murdered. So this is not just a little tea party. This is an expansive attempt to reorient 11 Confederate states back into the Union under drastic conditions. So what do you get? You get basically a Freedmen's Bureau. This is a bureau that would supposedly give us the former slaves now as citizens, but right away there's a problem. Slaves, as part of the initial compromise to build this country, were going to be counted as 3/5 of a human being, so that the South would be satisfied that their population base would be at least as large as some in the North. Now, if you freed all these slaves, the South's population would expand rapidly because now the slaves were 100% of a person, not just 3/5. So people worried about this. How was the South, which was beaten, going to regain its power base if in fact it had so many more citizens? And the problems grew and grew. But the Freedmen's Bureau tried as hard as they could, and not an easy road to go, to slowly bring in the former slaves as full citizens in the United States. Of course, this doesn't work out. The Freedmen's Bureau tries, and it has some small success, but almost beginning with their attempts is the organization of a very hideous and horrible unit called the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan has never gone away. You might notice that if you, in fact, pay any attention to popular culture. There is a rather famous film by one of the great filmmakers, W.D. Griffith. He made two very important films in Hollywood. Intolerance is one, and the one that is most difficult to understand is Birth of a Nation, which is basically a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. We should show that some night here at Piedmont Gardens. I'm just feared of a small revolution breaking loose. But it's interesting that it was a popular movie in the 20th century in America, Birth of a Nation, W.D. Griffith. And it's continued to haunt us, and the movies continue to come out. A recent movie by Spike Lee about the Klan being a spy for the Ku Klux Klan. All of this comes in the period of Reconstruction. And what to say about it? Well, there were people who had lots to say about it. One was named Garrison. He was a Black man from Massachusetts. And he was not even attracted by Lincoln and Lincoln's proposals, because Lincoln was being very careful. When in fact, John C. Fremont, famous for his California adventures, is in the Civil War as a commanding general, and he frees slaves in part of the occupied South. Even before the war is over, Lincoln has to fire him and send him packing, because Lincoln feared greatly that what would happen would be that once the border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, would see that the Lincoln group was about freeing slaves when they themselves had quite a number of slaves, it might drive them out of the Union to join the Confederacy. So Lincoln was always a man of balance to try and work this out. Unfortunately, he isn't around to work out Reconstruction because he's been assassinated. And the man who has now replaced him is a former slave owner and who is against the Reconstructionists and is then vetoing their legislation, and they're overriding his vetoes. So it's a standoff between the Congress and the presidency. Most historians believe that Johnson was not a very good president. He didn't know really what to do, and so he antagonized rather than try to compromise. And this antagonism grew to a difficult period of time where the Congress began to take over. The Congress felt it was their right, not the president's right, to bring the Southern rebels back in under certain strict conditions. So, what to do? Well, part of the process began to work. The race riots notwithstanding, Southern legislatures were established. They were established by people. It's funny, the war gave us a whole new language. And in the South, the language now was of people who got along with the Union. And so they were scallywags or, even worse, carpetbaggers. And we'd already done this with the war itself. We had the war. And in the time when General Hooker was, in fact, in command of Union forces, particularly the famous Army of the Potomac, and he came down to face Lee and his two sidekicks, Stonewall Jackson. And in the process, he was followed down by prostitutes who left Washington and saw a chance to make some money. And so Hooker's girls became known as hookers. And that word has lasted now as another word for prostitute. And it comes out of the Civil War, particularly with General Hooker, who's soon to lose his command as Lincoln is desperate to find a general who can attack and win, as opposed to watching Lee constantly win. And in fact, it's Lee's battles, nobody else's, but Lee's battles that are still studied at West Point, particularly the great battle at Chancellorsville, where Lee has his army on one side of the Rappahannock River, and the Yankee army is on the other side. And Lee then pulls an end run. He keeps his small contingent firing, so it looks like the whole army is there facing the Northern army across the river. In the meantime, under cover of darkness, he goes around the left, or in this case, his left and their right, and comes charging out the next morning, running down the flank of the Union Army and driving them back out of Northern Virginia again. This is after already the two battles at Bull Run. So you can understand that Lincoln has a pot full of trouble. He knows not where to turn. The team that he has as a cabinet, that team of rivals, are not much help. He's already offered the command of the Union forces to Robert E. Lee, who turned him down because he felt his loyalty was to the state of Virginia. All these things have happened to him in a very short period of time. He's also having to deal with Copperheads in the North. These are people who are anti-Lincoln and anti the war. And there is still a Democratic Party alive in the North, who's opposed to Reconstruction as they were opposed to the war. So you put all this together, it's a fine kettle of fish. And there is Lincoln, and then later Johnson, trying to bring off a successful reunion of the Union, and instead radical Reconstructionists who want to radically remake Southern society, which is causing these race riots in the North as early as the 1860s, particularly the one which was a massacre in New Orleans. But Freedmen's Bureau hangs in there. They began to elect legislators, which involved quite a number of African Americans who are going to serve in the Southern legislators. And they are going to vote, and they're going to be part of the process of the change of Southern institutions. And this will either go well in some counties or very badly in others. But it was an attempt to fix which had been called by the Northern press by now the Great Rebellion. In fact, the Union published 10 volumes And the name of the volumes are The Great Rebellion. They're the story as seen from the North, obviously. The North published them, and as Napoleon famously said, victors get to write the history. But now Reconstruction is going one way or another. And there will be attempts to find ways around it. The big discoveries through the Johnson administration. Let me give you a few examples. When I was working on my master's degree at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and I was there basically because I wanted to work in the Truman Library. Truman's someone I've always admired greatly, and I thought I could do my master's thesis there. And for one of my research papers, I took a long weekend and drove way out into the middle of Kansas. Now, what in the world is the middle of Kansas? Well, my friends, there is a small remaining town. It was a town that was settled by African Americans from the South who made a decision that they would not continue to live in their land of bondage. They would leave the South. And they were called by everyone at that time and later by historians, exodusters. And these exodusters went into Kansas, which is one of the flattest states you can ever be in. You can see forever on a clear day. And they went out into the middle of the state and founded a town. The town is called Nicodemus, Kansas. And in that town, they founded a church, a Southern Baptist church. They founded a school. They founded a newspaper. And they built their homes. And they began to farm, not cotton. Cotton doesn't grow in Kansas. They began to farm wheat. And they had a success initially. But the problem was that in Nicodemus, you could only move tons of wheat if you had the railroad stop there. And unfortunately, the railroad that was built did not stop in Nicodemus. So finally, the African Americans of Nicodemus moved on, not back to the South, I can tell you, but on to find a new place. But the town still survives. There's still issues of the newspaper and the local library. There's still a feeling that this was an escape mechanism for these people who were determined to leave bondage, but not to have themselves stuck in the South. And of course, they were quite right, because in the South, in the long run, the African American falls into a kind of new slavery. They find that the old Bourbon aristocrats have lost control of their plantations. And now the only way to find and make a living is to, in fact, go into a new kind of bondage. That is, to work the soil and to grow things. But to get the money to grow those things and the tools to work, one had to make a loan. And so you became a sharecropper. The person who made the loan, whether the old Bourbon aristocracy or the new leadership of the South, you never were able to pay off that loan. So you were forever working, making enough to live, and then paying off what you could of the loan, which continued to grow. It's a terrible situation, and it remained that way for decades to come. Sharecropping, the new bondage of the old South. And yet, this was allowed because no one saw a way out. Basically, what happens is the winners, the North, quickly bores of this entire problem. They think they have better things to do. So they're not interested. They never really cared that much for the African American, and they care less now. There is a wonderful book about this period in Southern history. It's written by a Berkeley professor who won a Pulitzer Prize. The professor is Leon Litwack, And his book is called Been in the Storm Too Long. Been in the Storm Too Long. It's a thick book. Takes some doing to read it, but in fact, it greatly details this period of time of Reconstruction. Another historian from the North, from Columbia, Eric Foner, also writes about this period. It's a rich period for Americans to write about, to think about, to know about. And as it goes on and goes down into history, it becomes a time of great sorrow, because until the great attempts to escape, many were small, like the exodusters going to Nicodemus. The first Black escape out of the Old South comes with World War I, when in fact, African Americans find they can get north and get jobs in the industrial North, jobs that are caused by the coming of the Great War, 1914. And then there's a second great burst out of the Old South, and that comes with the coming of 1941 and World War II, when huge numbers of African Americans again move out of what's left of the old Confederacy, and they moved west to places like California. It might be hard for you to know, but in fact, Oakland and Richmond basically became majority Black cities after World War I, in which these large numbers of people, both men and women, found jobs in the war industries. Some of the women actually became riveters, like Rosie the Riveter, and worked on ships, or they became welders and they worked on ships and other things like Wendy the Welder. These are token names for this huge number of people, white and Black, working class, but particularly Blacks who found an escape hatch out of the Old South. And so today it'd be very hard to find people locked into the bondage of sharecropping. But there still are a large number of African Americans living in the South. Many of them have returned to the South from the North. Strange as it might seem, African Americans happen to like living in the South. And both in Florida and Georgia, I know numbers of my friends who are African Americans. One, Phyllis Champion, has bought a gorgeous home down in Savannah, living like the white folks used to live. It's a strange world we inhabit. And we went through this long period, 11 years of Reconstruction, without much reconstructing being done. That is, without worthwhile efforts to free the bondsmen and make life at least palatable for these people who have suffered greatly and, in fact, suffer today. Where else but in America could you have a riot in Thomas Jefferson's old town of Charlottesville and have the leader of the country say, there were good people on both sides? Really? They don't seem good to me. And Charlottesville has enough problems without having someone come and add fuel. You know, the person who rode that car into the crowd and killed people has been found guilty of murder. Justifiably found so. A hard story to tell, but it's there. So what more can I tell you about this long travail? I've already told you it reoccurs over and over again. One, Harriet Beecher Stowe left us a wonderful book with wonderful characters like a little Eva, and that Jerry Robbins recreated it for a Broadway musical. I've told you that Leaves of Grass by that great American poet who was a male nurse during the Civil War has gone on for many publications. He himself kept adding to it so that by the time he died, there were around 8 versions of that long book-length poem of great power and beauty. Whitman was a man who was also very much a sensualist. So his book rings of the joy of sex, if you wish. His poetry is easy to read and to understand because it was written by a human being and has gone on to be very influential. Vaughan Williams himself has set part of the Leaves of Grass to music in our own time. So what to do with this story of Reconstruction? It was difficult. While we were trying to recover from the war, we were also trying to recover damages. Maybe you don't know the story of the full Navy, not just the Union Navy, which had a strategy called the Anaconda strategy of blockading all southern ports so that none of the king cotton could get out to market. But the Confederacy also went abroad, went to Britain, and bought a ship, the Confederate ship Alabama, which did quite a lot of damage to Union shipping. And it roamed the wild seas. It even put into Cape Town in southern Africa. So after the war, it was the job of Seward's State Department to bring financial charges against the British. And the British, not wanting any more trouble with these former American colonies, paid up. They paid the Alabama claims. And so you had some degree of a battle in the form of a Confederate raider. And the raiders that didn't raid, like the Alabama, then were in fact simply blockade runners. And I told you this last time, and I'll repeat it now. That's what Clark Gable does. Besides falling in love with Vivian Leigh in Gone with the Wind, he goes out as a blockade runner and makes a lot of money, running cotton beyond the blockade, collecting for the money, bringing the money back to the Southerners who owned the cotton. Was not unknown to be a blockade runner, even though Gone with the Wind is a very nostalgic view of the Old South, which many people very much dislike. People in my film committee are unhappy when I show it. But it's a historic document, as is Birth of the Nation, as is all those things that were made to try and explain the long and dreadful period. There are no really good films about Reconstruction. One, it went on too long. Secondly, it became part of a really ugly deal. It went on earlier than most people thought because once parts of the South were conquered and held, then people began to reconstruct that part that was conquered before the war was over. But the real date is 1865 to the first years of the 1870s. So over a decade. And what to do in trying to put those decades together? Well, slowly but surely, with the North becoming very bored with the story itself and some of the armies leaving, there are 3 armies still left in the South, 3 Union armies. And those people who have to bear under that are anxious to get rid of it. And then there's an election for president, and nobody wins. Shades of our election today. Certainly, I hope there's a person who's going to win. and put a long end to our long tragedy. But in those days, it wasn't that easy. And so those people who very much wanted Rutherford B. Hayes, an unknown president today, if you ask any American who was Hayes, they wouldn't know what to tell you. Well, they should know this part. Hayes could not become president without making a dirty political deed with the remaining occupied South. So particularly those states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, agreed to throw their votes to Hayes in return for a great gift. And that gift was to get the armies out of the South, all of them. And so it is that the land of the fire eaters, better known as South Carolina, where it all began, Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, the firing of Sumter, the fall of Sumter, all began, and now it will end because Carolina will see the last of Yankee occupiers leave, and they are, as someone might say later in life, free at last. But then you still have the problems of what to do. So you have a way of doing that. You have Jim Crow. That is, once the South can write its own laws, it disenfranchises the African American. Now, initially, it was a real problem because you were going to put on literacy tests. But suddenly, it became apparent that the vast majority of whites living in the South were illiterate. So now the vast majority of whites would not be able to vote because they couldn't pass a literacy test. So that wasn't going to work. Maybe you could put on a poll tax. Wasn't much, but it was more than the African American could afford. So it was that these dreadful laws were passed. And to this very day, in certain states, I give you Florida as an example, they refuse to let felons vote, even though the state itself voted to allow ex-felons who have paid their time and are now free citizens to vote again. Certain key people like that dreadful governor said no. So the Jim Crow laws crushed the African American one more time into slavery. And of course, the more that people looked around, the more difficult it got. I told you the story about the exodusters going to Nicodemus, Kansas. But let me tell you about another couple of stories that'll turn your hair white if it isn't already there. Indians had caught the same cancer that the rest of this country had caught. That is, Indians living in Indian territory, particularly in Oklahoma, part of the tribe, one of the tribe, two of the tribes, three, they decided they would buy slaves, and they were owning slaves. And so since they owned slaves, they were Indians who owned slaves, they supported the Confederacy. And then there were Indian tribes who didn't own slaves, and they supported the Union. And therefore, the Indian tribes went to war with each other in Indian territory over this issue of slavery. Unbelievable. but true. Indians owned slaves, but that's nothing like what I'm going to tell you now. Around 30 years ago, a very courageous historian did some very close research in Manchester County, Virginia. And he discovered this amazing thing, and he wrote his book. I wrote his book down so that I would not forget the title. His name is, I can't read my own handwriting. Edward Jones. And the name of the book is The Known World. The Known World. And what did he discover that was so surprising? He discovered a number of families living in this county in Virginia who had been free blacks for over a century. And what they had done was they had gone out and bought slaves themselves. So there were slave-owning blacks owning slaves in Virginia before and during the Civil War. And so now the problem was what to do with this property that was owned by these blacks who were already free, but the property they owned was black people. So now you have a world to itself. The world of African Americans owning African Americans, the world of African having to live under those conditions, the world of American Indians owning African Americans. It's unbelievable, but true. And how can they be reconstructed? How can they be set free? What to do? Will the border explode in the form of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, if they have to give up their slaves? That's why Lincoln is so slow. No Emancipation Proclamation immediately. Anyone who frees slaves in the newly conquered parts of the South was fired by Lincoln. Touch and go. So, what can I tell you? Walt Whitman wrote a great poem. With his own eyes, he saw the huge death rate in a hospital in Washington, D.C. Many Yankees who went south and opened the gates of the one large prisoner of war camp in Georgia, Andersonville, they saw the horror that American soldiers saw when they opened some of the death camps in Germany. Emaciated, half-dead Union prisoners. In that one case, the man in charge of that camp was in fact executed, but he was the only one. As much as the radical Reconstructionists wanted to take and hang, if possible, Robert E. Lee, somehow we think it's enough today to tear down the monuments as if that would atone for this tragedy that began in Virginia in 1619, when a ship came to Jamestown carrying blacks for sale. Or when Virginia my home state, was ruled during its first years of independence as part of the Union by slave owners. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. And so it was that radical Reconstruction came and went. Slavery began in Virginia. The first slave rebellion was in Virginia. Nat Turner in the 1830s. And then in a world turned upside down, there was a black man who was free in Virginia, who also owned other black men and women and children. And it went on forever, because the seeds of racism are with us today. In this very election that you are now participating in this day, there are in Florida black people who have served their time in jail, and in every other state that I can think of. Once you are free, you have your voting rights returned to you. Florida has not returned them. You've lost them forever, not just a year, not just a decade, forever. Bouncy, bumpy. But we will get through it. And even Florida might turn blue. It's hard to believe that their governor went to Yale and to Harvard. Remember, I told you another book that was published at Berkeley called North of Slavery, which maintains basically that it was as bad in the North as it was in the South. Why do you think in great cities like New York City, blacks only felt safe and comfortable in their own corner of the jungle, the urban jungle? Harlem. I happen to love Harlem. It's a wonderful place to go. Wonderful jazz clubs. But don't try and move to the more restricted parts. In New York City, a way you can restrict, of course, is covenants. There are covenants in some buildings against Jews, let alone blacks. There was a wonderful woman, she's Russian origin. In fact, there were two of them, Helena Rubinstein and Estee Lauder. They made things for women called makeup, perfume. And they couldn't buy. So one of them decided to outfox the real estate people. And while she'd been turned down on one building by a vote of the people who lived in the building, she went and bought the building. And then she moved in. So whether it's anti-Black, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitism, these haunting, ugly things are with us. And they are particularly gruesome for the African American, because way into this century, there were towns all through the so-called Reconstruction South where cops would tell black, "Don't let the sun set on you tonight in this county." There were trees throughout the American Reconstructed South that were known as the hanging trees, when many innocent people were lynched. Reconstruction. It didn't work out the way anyone thought it would work out. Either this very weak and poor President Johnson, or even the ones who followed. Rutherford B. Hayes, who got into office by making a dirty political deal, not the first deal to ever be made that's dirty in politics, particularly involving the American presidency. Probably won't be the last. Crooks are highly sought of in some sectors of American society, particularly in places like Washington, D.C. So we will see. What we can make of this is a time of trouble, that it did not end racism, that it did not make for a better way into the future for any group of people, let alone African Americans. Some African Americans have done the ways that Irish people like my folks do, or Jews do. They go to Hollywood. They become Hollywood stars. I give you Margaret O'Brien, Barry Fitzgerald, Bing Crosby, Maureen O'Hara. The list of the Irish goes on. I give you American blacks, Lena Horne, Dorothy Dandridge, or our man from Lily of the Fields, which we recently showed here, Sidney Poitier, who was the man who came to dinner, and a huge number of American Jews. I give you Barbara Streisand, Bette Midler, but not everybody had the talent to succeed in Hollywood. And the law offices in New York are generally closed to them. I give you the famous film Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck. The problems were immense. We are a continental-sized country with great diversity. And I'm sure that we will work towards settling it once the election is announced, the victor tomorrow or the next day, or at least this week, thank God. Hopefully we can move on against these troubling problems that have never been cured, that stay like a cancer in our society. We shall see. There is an African-American woman actually running as vice president. Who would have thought? And running with her is a Catholic, another one of those Catholics. The last one was assassinated. I'm referring to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, one of the Irish, in case you don't know. So we shall see. The results tonight or soon. And then a campaign to make things better for the less fortunate. We're an extremely rich country, but the riches are very badly divided. We're top heavy with billionaires. I bet none of them have been reconstructed. Top heavy, unequal. We had that huge burst of energy under the LBJ administration, a Southerner no less than Lyndon Johnson, trying to pass civil rights and being told by Senator George that he had lost the South. And in fact, civil rights legislation under LBJ drove the old Confederacy into the arms of the Republican Party for all the wrong reasons. You can't reconstruct them, you make Republicans out of them. Lincoln would be amazed. Well, I've beat the subject to death. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to understand that next week, for you who can stand the pressure, we will turn to President Ulysses S. Grant, a general who drank and a president who drank and who ran a terrible administration, a spoil system gone wild, but who knew how to win battles. Lincoln said once of Grant, once he really discovered him, and he was told, you know, you should be careful, Mr. Lincoln, that man drinks. Lincoln turned and said, find out what he drinks. I will send a case of that to all my other generals. It's a typical Lincoln remark. And we will deal with Mr. Grant, who ended up dying a terrible death of cancer of the jaw and desperately trying to finish his memoirs, which are considered by historians today the greatest memoirs of any general who ever set pen to pencil. They're very much treasured in their 2-volume state. Otherwise, it's now 2 minutes to closing time. So not only did we start a minute early, we're going to end a minute early. And thank you for watching and listening. And I will see you, I hope, next week for Ulysses S. Grant and his 8 years as President of the United States of America. Goodbye.